Welcome to episode 10 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. We're pleased that this episode is organized in partnership with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. We thank Dr. Kishan Manocha, Senior Advisor on Freedom of Religion or Belief at OSCE ODIHR, and his team for the leadership and contribution to the advancement of freedom of religion or belief. Today, Dr. Manocha will share a distinguished panel of experts. Together, they will look at how the pandemic has affected freedom of religion and belief and the different consequences for men and women, boys and girls. We look forward to their presentations. Now I invite all panelists and participants to respond to a poll that you will see on your screen right now. It will allow us and our speakers, and will give us an idea of our global audience. So thank you very much for taking a minute. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our series landing page, where we also publish information about upcoming episodes, and you will see the link in the chat box. You can type your questions or upvote others at any time using the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen. Please keep your text short and to the point. That will make it easier for us and the moderators to pass them on to the chair. If you get disconnected, just use the link that you have received when you registered to join back in. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School, Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. I will now broadcast the results of the live poll and introduce Dr. Manocha. Kishan Manocha is the senior advisor on freedom of religion or belief at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, Poland. Kishan has extensive experience in freedom of religion or belief and related human rights issues in Europe, North America, the Middle East, and North Africa, and Central and South Asia. As an advocate, researcher, trainer, and consultant to a number of international and non-governmental organizations. He is currently a member of the Global Steering Committee of the Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors to prevent incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. We look forward to you chairing this panel, and I'll give you the floor, Kishan.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And I want to say at the outset that OSCE ODIHR has followed these series of webinars with great interest and is particularly delighted to be, if you like, taking a lead in facilitating this very important conversation, which is, of course, part of a broader, an integral to and part of a broader conversation around COVID-19, religion, freedom of religion or belief, which has, of course, been in and of itself, this conversation, a remarkable feature of our recent times, because 4 or 5 months ago, we wouldn't have been having this particular conversation. And two, if you like, broad themes have emerged among many as part of this wider discussion. One is the impact that measures to combat the virus have had on the exercise of freedom of religion or belief. And the other very interesting theme that has emerged is the role of religious and belief actors and leaders and communities in combating the pandemic. Having said that, one dimension of this discussion has been highlighted, has been explored, but requires, we would say, in putting together this webinar, some careful consideration and some systematic, if you like, consideration, which is the gender dimension to all of this. Now, we know that COVID-19 has a gendered impact. The different repercussions for women and girls have been well documented, but what are the different consequences for men and women and boys and girls in terms of their exercise of freedom of religion or belief in light of the pandemic? And what can we say also about the differing roles that male and female religious leaders and actors have played in responding to COVID-19. And if we are to capture all the relevant and important lessons from this crisis with respect to freedom of religion or belief, then we would do well. I would suggest we must reflect carefully and sensitively on the different perspectives, experiences of men and women, of boys and girls, and to consider how to make these or their respective concerns, their experiences, challenges and opportunities integral to the framing of policies, strategies, plans and actions as we emerge from this crisis, move forward from here. So if you like, it is time for a gender mainstreamed conversation around COVID-19, religion and freedom of religion or belief. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome three distinguished experts to be part of this conversation, to facilitate this conversation with us today. And they are, as you know, Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Mine Yildirim, who is the head of the Freedom of Belief Initiative of the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and a member of the OSCE ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief. And also we have, of course, Mariam Gaftadze, who is Director of Strategic Litigation at the Tolerance and Diversity Institute in Georgia, and who is also a member of the OSCE ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief. You have seen their biographies. I won't therefore rehearse what's in that. I've just given you a brief introduction to who they are. They've agreed among themselves to speak in the following order: Mariam, or Mako, as she's better known, Mine and Ahmed. They will address among themselves the questions that have been highlighted in the announcement, and they will each have around 9 to 10 minutes to do that. And following the conclusion of their presentations, we will then have a period of hopefully 30 minutes for questions and answers. Please feel free to submit your questions as the webinar proceeds. We've had a number of pre-submitted questions, which I looked at, and I will draw a few of those that are particularly relevant to this conversation. So we look forward to a very interesting discussion, and we will start, first of all, with Mako. Over to you.
Thank you, Kishan. I want to first of all thank the organizers of this series of very important discussions on freedom of religion, on COVID-19 and the new reality we are all facing in this world. I will address how is the pandemic affecting freedom of religion or belief, and what has been differential impact on women and men, on girls and boys. But first of all, I think we have to analyze what has the implications been for freedom of religion or belief, first of all. And I have been witnessing all this as a participant of the situation, being in the middle of this pandemic situation, like many of us, but also from the civil society perspective, working on freedom of religion or belief issues and supporting dialogue between religious communities, religious organizations, and state and religion. So there is no doubt that the pandemic has affected all lives, no matter what is our faith, what is our gender, what is our social status. But there is no doubt also that it has affected in a different ways. For example, it has become some kind of opportunity for novelty for many. But on the other hand, many people have faced challenges, have faced discrimination and violence. So it has been more harsh for many people around the globe. All states addressed pandemic and freedom of religion issue in different ways. More examples that I will use, it will be used from my perspective that I observed in my country, Georgia, but also what I observed worldwide and what was common in most of the societies. First of all, when there were discussions about freedom of religion or belief, the first question that was asked, especially among the lawyers, among the state representatives, Is the religious gathering part of freedom of religion or belief, or it's an ordinary gathering? And how should it be addressed? And there were many advocates among the civil society, among the lawyers and the government, who said that it's an ordinary gathering and ordinary limitations, standard limitations, have to be applied on freedom of religion or belief. But also there was different opinion saying that, especially in the situation where states enacted state of emergency decrees and legislation, and we know that freedom of religion or belief cannot be limited during the state of emergency situation. So where do we take these religious assemblies, religious rituals, and how can it be addressed? It's really good that most of religious organizations made decision to adjust, to change something, and they made this decision by themselves, even before it was mandatory set by the states. But some states had also to deal with some religious organizations who did not want to change their traditions, their rules. And also the timing was very important. It was around the world, it was timing when Christians were celebrating Easter, and for Muslims it was very important months, and they had to change their whole life, their religious life totally. And of course it was not easy. The first issue that we face in these situations is discrimination. Are all religions treated equally? Are the rules applied equally for all religious organizations or not? In the country where I live, these rules were not applied equally, and some had more privileges and some had less. But what is most important, what I'm glad to say that, for example, in Georgia, the majority of religious organizations, they declared that most important is to care about the health of people, and we have to change something. And they starting from zero, how to adjust, how to use these technologies, and how to implement new regulations inside their communities. But also another very important thing is the support coming from religious leaders, because everybody needs support in this kind of situation, and just recommendations and warnings and rules coming from the state is not enough. We all need some kind of support in the family, in our religious circles, and so on. So the role of the religious organizations was very crucial and important in these hard times. So discussions, when it comes to minorities, especially in the religious communities, when it comes to religious minorities, we witnessed that the hate speech has become more active, and the harassment, and it was all linked with the pandemic situation. But I don't think the problems that people were facing in the frames of human rights, it was something new. And the gender problems also, gender equality problems. Everything was there. But this pandemic situation showed us, it brought everything on the surface. And we had more time to reflect on, we had more time to discuss. So everything happened during this 1 or 2 months, and we had time and opportunity for more reflection. When speaking about gender and when speaking about rights of women, there is no doubt that gender equality is a big issue and a big challenge, not only during the pandemic, but generally it's a big challenge, and the situation is different in various countries. It might be in the situation where the laws guarantee equality, still some traditions, even some religious organizations do not support full equality between men and women. So the first issue that was very visible in this situation was violence and domestic violence during the pandemic, because because women who already were facing some kind of problems of discrimination, of violence, they had to stay home. They did not have the space to speak up, to look for help. And in these times, the role of civil society, role of religious communities is very important. To speak up for them, to offer the help, to speak to the perpetrators also, and to communicate also with the state how to offer help to the victims of domestic violence. But not only women are victims of such violence, and we must not forget LGBTI people who are very vulnerable in many situations, and especially in such kind of situation, in the pandemic situation. A very, very painful thing happened in Georgia when transgender women were left beyond any support during the pandemic. They had no income, and they do not have any support even from their families. They're all alone, and the only chance to survive, they had to work, but they lost the only income they had during these times. And the tragic thing was when one transgender woman who could not get any support from the state set herself on fire in front of the city hall. But it's really tragic. It was really hard to see this scene, but it also changed something. It also raised some kind of empathy, some kind of understanding. And what happened for the first time here in Georgia, that Orthodox priests decided to stay anonymous, but still to help transgender women to send food, first aid things, and to offer such kind of support. And the bishop of the Evangelical Baptist Church offered the church building to all victims of violence or homeless people, including the transgender women. So this was something that we could also, besides that it was very hard and it was tragic, this was also time for many, and including for religious organizations, to change something, to reflect on, and also not to stand on the side of the violence or on the side of the hate speech, but also to use their power, how to provide help for women, for victims, for LGBTI people. When speaking about women's problems also, it's very important that many people lost jobs. Not only women, men also lost jobs, but we know that in many families, women have many roles. Besides working, earning money, supporting their families, they take care about children, they take care about household, and they had to multitask all this in working and taking care about their family. But also what is very important, the emotional support, because very often women are the ones who provide emotional support to their family members, who provide support, this kind of support to their children. And they had to manage this emotional situation in the families also, because the children were also stressed. They had to adjust, they had to study in a different way. They could not go out and play and so on. So this situation showed that how powerful, in fact, women are, but how necessary it is to speak up for women and to advocate for them. And how big is the role of religious leaders in the situations to speak up for women and gender equality and also LGBTI people's rights. When people are in minority communities, they already face discrimination in many directions. This might be access to quality education, access to healthcare. They are already discriminated. So during the pandemic, especially girls, especially women, became really vulnerable to access healthcare, to access quality education, beyond facing multiple social problems and some facing violence and discrimination in this situation. And to conclude, very often we do not see a synergy between freedom of religion or belief and gender, and very often they are discussed very separately. And in fact, they can reinforce each other and they can be enforced mutually quite well. So now I think it's time to start considering the importance of verb and the importance of gender equality together, and to find the ways how to enforce them together. And the role of civil society, the role of the governments, role of religious organizations and leaders is crucial in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mako, for those opening reflections and particularly for introducing or highlighting the importance of building synergies between freedom of religion or belief and gender equality to important human rights, of course, concerns, interconnected, interrelated human rights concerns. And we look forward to the further discussion about this whole question of synergies and how we can build them, how we can actually operationalize and ensure they're appropriately considered by all actors. So thank you again, and over now to Mine, please.
Thank you, Kishan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to join this panel on this very important topic, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting me and also choosing this topic. Before I address my question, I'd just like to add to Mako's excellent points that the pandemic has brought the home actually to the forefront, also as a place of where interferences in the right to freedom of religion or belief of women especially take place. This can be attributed to similar reasons to this skyrocketing in domestic violence, I think, but Christian, Muslim, atheist women were cut off from the spaces of freedom that they had created for themselves outside of the home, where they could practice their religion or belief in the way they want or come close to it, where they live in maybe homes where there is no such freedom. So these links to these spaces was cut off due to lockdowns in many countries. And women were forced to be to comply with the ways of manifesting or religion or belief or religious practice in their homes, and they were limited in having access to communities where they could practice their religion or belief the way they chose to do. So I think this is an area which we need to look into in a more detailed way. But I'll now move on to my own question, and I will use a PowerPoint presentation for that. The question I will try to address today is, how can governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, religious or belief communities, and the academy best address the gender dimension of the pandemic's impact on freedom of religion or belief? So I will try to look at three main themes: understanding the gender dimension of the pandemic's impact on freedom of religion or belief, and secondly, to identify some of the key measures that need to be taken, and also identifying actors who and their responsibilities. So first of all, of course, properly addressing an issue requires, first of all, a proper understanding of the issue. While in the last couple of years, the gender dimension of freedom of religion or belief has been given attention more than ever before, with a number of in-depth reports published, starting with Nazile Ghanea's report, and then Mariol Peterson, and then more recently, the UN Special Rapporteur's report. We are yet to draft a holistic framework of reference based on human rights standards to systematically frame this complex issue in a way that can guide governments, civil society organizations, religious or belief communities. The need for such guidance is even more urgent during the pandemic, which has changed ways of operating for religious or belief communities and individuals, and also the quality of access to many important human rights. So I am sharing with you a work in progress, a proposed framework, which I have adapted from the framework that we use in our monitoring work. And some of the basic terms of such a framework would include the right to freedom of religion or belief, non-discrimination, interferences in human rights based on religious or alleged religious practice, enabling environment for the enjoyment of human rights. So the first category here is to look at the components of the right to freedom of religion or belief, and then ask key questions like, what if and to what extent individuals of different gender are able to exercise these rights, and to what extent do they need positive measures to be taken so that their gendered manifestations can be protected, and how do limitations on these components of freedom of religion or belief impact LGBT plus individuals, men, women, girls, and boys. So very quickly, the right to have, change, leave a religion or belief, right to be free from coercion, and the right to manifest religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. And this, of course, as you know, includes a broad range of acts depending on the scope of the religion or belief in question. So use of religious symbols and clothing, participation in worship, including access to places of worship, and associative rights, and teaching, including interpretation of religious texts, and raising one's children in line with one's religious or philosophical views. And when we consider non-discrimination, it's important to have an intersectional approach to prohibition of discrimination based on religion or belief and other human rights. For example, a person can be a person of a specific gender who is a member of a certain religion can be subject to discrimination, whereas a person from the same religion of a different gender may not be subject to discrimination. So it's important to have this intersectional approach, and also to look at other rights, such as the right to education or access to justice, right to health, whether people of different religions are discriminated against in accessing these rights. Thirdly, the interferences in human rights that have gendered impact based on argument that it is a religious practice need to be looked at. And finally, whether there is an enabling environment for human rights. Understanding the impact of such an environment is important. Here, for example, we can look at hate speech and hate crimes targeting particular religions or belief groups or non-believers, and whether this has a gendered impact. So identifying measures and key actors. And in very brief terms, I would say development of guidance, systematic and collaborative monitoring and action is our key themes to look at during this time. First, I'd say creating space for women, girls, boys, LGBT plus individuals to express how their right to freedom of religion or belief and how other human rights are impacted on grounds of religion or belief, and then accordingly take action. First, we have to understand how these individuals are impacted, and we don't have a systematic and broad understanding, in my view, at the moment. this is something that the governments need to be doing. Religious or belief communities need to create this space and then make the views of these people public, and also humanist organizations can do this, human rights organizations and intergovernmental organizations and academia. So all hands on deck, we can say, for this measure. And a good practice, for example, from my own country is the Hawli Association. It's a feminist Muslim association, reaching out to their network of women and creating a platform for them to express how their problems connected to living in accordance with their own religious understanding during the lockdown, as they had to live with the families where they had to often comply with the religious practice of the family. So how they provided them a platform to actually share their experiences. And connected to that, of course, supporting online capacities would be important, but with a caution, I would say, because there is limits to having access to online meetings and communication. Not everyone has broadband internet or a smartphone. So for human rights, for many organizations, also including the gender dimension of freedom of religion or belief in their monitoring and reporting work, it is very important. And here I couldn't emphasize enough the collaboration needed between women's rights or gender equality organizations and religious freedom organizations or religious or belief communities. There is a lot of untapped potential there. For example, conceptual and in terms of harmonizing conceptual and legal frameworks, methodology, and access to those impacted. There is a lot of potential for creating synergies between these particular two groups, and they can definitely bring together their know-how to develop indicators and guidance for monitoring. Similarly, for national human rights institutions and equality bodies, they need to make the monitoring freedom of religion or belief, and then also the gender dimension of freedom of religion or belief a part of their work, and similarly for UN treaty bodies and special procedures. So as Makao has also highlighted, domestic violence has skyrocketed in all countries, and immediate and strong measures to protect against harmful practices and violence at home are needed. And again, increased awareness raising campaigns about this phenomenon is necessary. And sometimes this violence can be based on arguments related to religious freedom. We don't know these because often organizations that monitor and report on domestic violence don't ask these questions about religious freedom issues. So government response, of course, as number one, responsible to protect human rights, but NGOs to advocate, highlight, and monitor this situation. And also religious actors can do a lot to create awareness among their own communities, and also monitor and report such cases that they are aware of to protect women and, of course, all vulnerable people at home. And for increasing capacity to monitor implementation of obligations of states and follow-up of this implementation is something that intergovernmental organizations can do. So they need to increase their own capacity to be able to effectively monitor the implementation of states of international human rights standards. And I think they also need to be part of developing indicators and sharing guidance and developing them, obviously in collaboration with a broad range of actors. So key concepts to focus are the need for broad collaborations between different actors, and also using the whole catalog of human rights, not only freedom of religion or belief. We have a very big toolbox, and we can draw from all human rights. I think this pandemic has also brought to the forefront again the indivisibility and interdependence of human rights for all. I think these are my initial remarks, and I look forward to more discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mine, for that very clear and comprehensive outline of this proposed framework for addressing and understanding and the gender dimension to freedom of religion and belief, particularly highlighted by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also for sharing in particular some emerging good practices, which is always very, very useful to draw on and to consider as we proceed with this discussion. So anyway, without further ado, I hand over to Ahmed, please.
Thank you very much, Kishan. Thank you all for organizing this event and for joining us this afternoon. I am delighted to join this panel discussion on the intersection between freedom of religion or belief, which I shall call FORB, and gender in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has shown, as we have heard, the important role that religion and belief-based actors play and can play in addressing global challenges. Mariam and Mina have covered specific aspects of how state responses to the pandemic have impacted on the FORB rights of women and girls, and identified a number of challenges as well as some good practices. So my task today is to look to the future on the implications of the current situation for the better protection of women and girls' FORB rights, and for the interlinks between FORB and gender equality in general. A number of points have already been raised that are relevant to this wider, longer-term perspective. Major events that raise challenges and lead to impacts of the scale and scope of what we are witnessing during this pandemic can obviously have significant effects on longer-term trends, and the outcomes can be very severe. What we are witnessing is a major pushback against fundamental freedoms, dramatic changes in lifestyle, drastic contraction in economic productivity, and seismic reallocation of resources and reordering of priorities. We can expect, therefore, the impacts to be quite severe. Equality is at the core of human rights and constitutes, as in the words of the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the foundation of peace, freedom, and justice in the world. And the pandemic has highlighted the inequalities that persist and afflict our societies. Well, we have taken many of our activities online. As Mina just noted, only half the world's population have access to the internet. Some can take their work online and keep on earning. Others cannot take their work online, especially those who are in vulnerable situations. I mentioned the digital divide for two reasons. First of all, there is empirical evidence of a gendered dimension to the digital divide. It's not just tradition that is patriarchal. Even technology appears to be patriarchal. Women and sexual minorities are less likely to find online content that is relevant or of interest to them as perhaps men might do. So the virtual world replicates the patriarchy in the offline world. Going online, as many of us have to do, also means is surveillance or other forms of invasions of privacy, which can be inimical to the enjoyment of FORB rights. This can be the case particularly in countries that persecute religious minorities or in contexts where harassment and violence against sexual and gender minorities is rampant. We in the FORB community not have had occasion to engage much with the digital divides before, but we have always engaged on addressing inequality. Moving forward, we need to make 4 issues more prominent in the ITU's Connect 2030 agenda, whose 5 goals already are committed to inclusion, other goals being growth, partnership, sustainability, and innovation. Addressing various digital divides is important because the cyberspace is the premier public forum today. It is a space that religious communities already use widely for the dissemination of their views. It is important that this space is inclusive of the interests of women, girls, and sexual minorities, and indeed of everyone on an equal footing. One of the costs of the pandemic has been a distraction from the important SDG agenda, and also an intensification of the pushback on human rights in general. As speakers have noted, one of the consequences is also the rise in hatred and intolerance. The gender dimensions of these measures and trends have been noted, and I want to stress some of these. Pandemic emergency measures run the risk of deepening structural barriers to the equal rights of men, women, including right to FOB. In some states, women and girls who are members of religious and ethnic minorities at heightened risk of experiencing gender-based violence, as Mariam has noted. Similarly, women who are members of religious and ethnic minorities experience greater challenges in accessing healthcare, adequate food, housing, water, and sanitation, meaning they may be particularly affected as a result of the pandemic in fragile contexts accompanied by hate speech in particular. The gendered nature of the health workforce globally and the health risks that health workers incur is also relevant, given the outsized role that faith-based organizations play in providing healthcare worldwide. LGBT plus persons are subject to increased surveillance and stigmatization in many, many countries. In regard to the long term, it is essential that we get back to the SDG commitments of leaving no one behind. It is especially important in ensuring that the socio-economic fallout of the lockdowns do not have gendered impacts that expose women, girls, and sexual minorities to greater hardship or become victimized by intolerance. Likewise, we need to be mindful of and respond to the gendered aspects of human rights regression. We must reinforce the need for policymakers to take a human rights-based approach grounded on inclusion. This applies strongly to FOB and gender equality. Finally, let me touch upon the interlinks between FOB and gender equality. FOB, international human rights law, is interrelated, indivisible, and mutually reinforcing with other human rights, as Nina just explained, and is interwoven with the core principles of equality and non-discrimination. In my report to the UN Human Rights Council this past March, I examined the global phenomenon of gender-based violence and discrimination in the name of religion or belief, and underscored the interdependence of FOB and the right to non-discrimination. One cannot be fully protected without the other. States must create enabling environments to advance both non-discrimination and FOB rights. Some states have taken important measures aimed at creating conditions in which all members of society are able to exercise their rights on an equal footing. Other states have made less effort, using laws and policies to discriminate in the name of religion or belief. In every region of the world, one can identify laws enacted with the aim of mandating standards of conduct claimed to be demanded by a particular religion that effectively deny women and other individuals the right to non-discrimination on the basis of their sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. As my report emphasizes, the role of religious groups in perpetuating norms that promote gender inequitable attitudes is complex because religious communities themselves are not homogeneous. A multitude of voices exist within religious groups and institutions, including faith-based actors who campaign the right of women and work to promote gender equality. Work makes clear that religions are not the source of gender-based discrimination and violence, but that rather interpretations of those beliefs underlie such discrimination. The role that religious and belief communities can play in promoting equality and inclusion for all is invaluable. As Mariam said, there are important synergies that need to be tapped into. I encourage states, civil society, and faith-based actors to continue to press for equality. This is the time to strengthen the inclusive application of critical norms and standards. It will be important to build bridges among communities advocating for FOB rights and those advocating for rights of women and girls, as well as those advocating for LGBT plus persons. These different communities need to come together and work together. I'm hoping that the digital divides and gendered impacts manifested during the pandemic will reinvigorate our efforts to build societies that are inclusive and grounded on freedom and equality for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and in particular for looking ahead, reminding us of the broader interlinks, interrelationship between FOB and gender equality, and particularly calling our attention to the role of FOB and integrating FOB into all conversations, including the sustainable development goals in relation to equality at this time. Now, we have around 10 to 12 minutes, and we have a number of questions that are coming through. And I'd like to take a few at the outset, those which are particularly relevant to the topic we're considering today. So, for Mako, Mina, and Ahmed to consider and to share your reflections, here are two initial questions. What more can be done for women religious leaders' voices to be heard? What more can be done to ensure that we hear the voices of women religious leaders? That's one question. And the other question I'd like to put to you at this point is, it is of course important to protect against invidious discrimination, but how can the rights of religious or belief communities to maintain doctrinal beliefs related to gender differences be protected at the same time? Just to repeat, it is of course important to protect against invidious discrimination, but how can the rights of religious or belief communities to maintain doctrinal beliefs related to gender differences be protected at the same time? I hope you've captured those questions, and start with Mako for a few minutes, and then Mina and Ahmed, and if there's still time, we'll have a further round of questions and answers.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who participated and asked questions. It's a very important topic indeed. To start with the first question, what more can be done for hearing voices of women religious leaders? In Georgia, for example, we have very good example of having woman bishop of Evangelical Baptist Church, and she's a big advocate for gender equality and for women's rights and for generally human rights. She's a brilliant example how women can support and enforce other women. But of course, these voices are not enough, and I think religious organizations themselves have to start rethinking of empowering more and more women within their circles, for them to be more visible, for them to reach out to more people, because sometimes it's not enough when speaking about gender equality from organizational perspective if you yourself do not demonstrate that you stand on those values also, and you have that kind of diversity. I understand that every community has its own rules, their own doctrines, but as much as it's possible to be done, it can be done. So it's not just inventing something new, but rethinking the existing practices and doing more. And to go with this to the second question, I think it can coexist quite well to maintain the religious beliefs, the religion doctrines, and also to advocate for equality. We're not speaking about changing changing beliefs, about changing what's important for belief. And of course I value and I will protect whatever is important for the community and religious or belief organization itself. But here we were speaking about violence. Here we were speaking about discrimination. So religion has not to do anything with this. The religion has not to do anything with violence, anything with discrimination. And on the contrary, it can do more to support people to live in a better world. So this is the most important what religious communities can do to speak up and to support the victims of discrimination and violence and to empower more and more women. And also if it contradicts LGBTI issues, if it contradicts their religious beliefs, they can support humans. They can protect humans from violence. They can protect humans from being discriminating without changing their beliefs, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mako, and over to Mine and then to Ahmed. If we could have just a couple of minutes because we can take a few more questions after this round. Thank you. And over to Mine.
Okay, thank you. So for the first question, what more can be done for women religious leaders to be heard? I think simply to ask them. It's actually quite simple. If questions are directed to them, for example, in the media, when blogs are posted or when articles are written, news are reported, simply including them, their views, and of course making it safe. Sometimes they can be also subjected to intolerance or hate speech, but we have to have enough other voices that come along and support them and basically condemn intolerance against them. So for NGOs and for intergovernmental organizations, when they organize meetings, webinars, etc., to include women religious actors or in dialogue meetings, etc. So basically asking them. About the second question, it is difficult to talk about limitations in abstract because thinking about individual discrimination, but also then whether and to what extent religious or belief groups can actually maintain their doctrinal beliefs related to gender differences, how to protect them at the same time. It is difficult to talk about this in abstract. It would look differently in relation to the case in question. But generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is to actually bring in all applicable human rights standards into the discussion while we are analyzing or looking at a particular case. So that would include, of course, gender equality. Sometimes it would include prohibition of torture, for example, in the case of harmful practices. And then, of course, we have to look at the right to freedom of religion or belief, and particularly the limitations clause. And of course, autonomy and conscientious objection. I think all of these would have to be considered in a given case. And there might be cases where the doctrinal beliefs or the way they are used and implemented or practiced may not be acceptable. They may have to change because they are maybe leading to harmful practices. But this is not always the case. As I say, harmonizing all applicable human rights norms would be the starting point.
Thank you.
All right, if I may, yes, the first question, I think I agree with the previous speakers, in fact, on both questions. And I think the short answer is that two things. One is state needs to protect the expressive rights of women. That is to say that, you know, the use of blasphemy laws or other laws that seem to provide chilling effects, create chilling effects in public space for women religious leaders, or to I think be addressed by states. So providing a safe space in which they can actually express themselves. That's one. The other is, as the speakers pointed out, to make these discussions inclusive, that also require, I think, some form of literacy on the part of the media and the other public space about diversity in religions. Professor Chirian George wrote a book called Hate Spin. He speaks about fostering radical pluralism as a way to promote, as a way to contest hate speech. In other words, making the public sphere safe for everyone to articulate themselves. That'll be one. In terms of second question, I think there is some guidance in the forum internum, forum externum division that we make with regard to protecting rights, freedom, or belief. So whatever one believes, I think the state the state cannot actually interfere at all in that dimension. But in terms of, you know, the obligation upon states to raise young children in a climate of tolerance and so on and so forth, there are issues about how some of these beliefs may be dealt with in that context. But state cannot interfere in the actual doctrinal beliefs of any group. But the manifestation of that has to be limited, can be limited when that results in harm to other people. That's a kind of very simple rule of thumb. But I agree with Mina's more sophisticated answer that we need to take a holistic approach to this that looks into all rights that have to be considered. I also want to point out that current legal practices protect what is called the religious ethos of organizations that enables them to, you know, non-discrimination isn't an unqualified right. You can use objective and reasonable criteria that can warrant discriminatory practices, but in a very, very narrow space. So if you require teachers to disseminate doctrinal beliefs and this requires a certain type of teacher, then I think within limited senses, this can be done. But generally speaking, non-discrimination has to be upheld. So I think the forum internum, forum externum divide and the commitment to associative rights are rules of thumb that can be used to protect doctrinal beliefs of organizations, but at the same time ensuring that the practice of these, the expression of these beliefs does not result in rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you all for your very helpful answers to those questions. I note that we are 1 minute away from the formal close, and it would be, I think, invidious on my part to select any of the excellent questions that remain to be answered, given that it wouldn't be enough time, I think, to do any of them justice. So I will hand over to Francesco to close the meeting. But before I do that, I wish to thank Marco, Mina, and Ahmed very much indeed for your very thoughtful, very considered presentations, and for drawing also on your own experiences and experiences more widely afield, I would say, on this all-important question of the relationship between women's rights to equality, gender equality, at this very critical time of the pandemic, but looking ahead to the situation that we'll all be in once we emerge fully and recover fully, and hopefully we will recover fully from the effects of COVID-19. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Kishan, and thank you all for being with us today. Let's give a virtual round of applause to our panel and the hosts who made this panel possible. has been a very interesting discussion, and I would like to thank you again, the chair and the panelists, for your contribution. Thank you again for the participants for joining us from many places, and we appreciate your engagement and participation. I'm happy to announce our next webinars. Registration on our landing page will open soon for episode 11 next week, the 18th of June at 3 p.m. Brussels time. This webinar will focus on Africa and the Middle East with experts and academics from these regions. Episode 12 on the 25th of June will instead focus on COVID-19, freedom of religious belief, and the contribution of faith-based humanitarian organizations. We invite you to keep an eye on our landing page, or if you have given permission to send emails, look for upcoming invitations for more details. Although we cannot see you, we really appreciate your support throughout the series. Many thanks again to the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights for contributing to this and for joining efforts for this wonderful panel. And we look forward to welcoming you next Thursday. Have a wonderful day, and thank you very much.